The room went so quiet that Olive Rourke could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. She stood at the front of the Territorial Land Office in Amarillo, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, facing a panel of 3 commissioners who looked at her the way men always looked at women who dared walk into rooms that were not meant for them. Their eyes held that particular brand of dismissal that she had spent 26 years learning to outlast. Behind her sat a gallery of ranchers, lawyers, and landowners, all of them male, all of them watching with the collective curiosity of wolves observing something that had wandered too far from its own territory. Luke Hadley sat in the second row, silent as stone. He had not said a single word since the hearing began 2 hours ago. Not when Commissioner Greer mispronounced his name, not when the railroad attorney with the slick black cravat called his claim frivolous and unsubstantiated, and not even when that same attorney had the audacity to present a deed so obviously forged that the ink bloomed on the parchment like a bruise. Luke just sat there with his hat in his hands and his jaw set hard enough to crack hickory, and Olive had watched the muscles in his neck work like a man trying to swallow something that refused to go down. She had not come here for him. She had come as a surveyor. As the only licensed female land surveyor in the New Mexico and Texas territories, which was an accomplishment that had cost her 3 years of correspondence study, a 200-mile journey to Austin to sit for the examination alongside men who laughed at her before she outscored every last one of them, and the better part of her savings. She had been hired to present survey data for a separate claim, one that had already been settled an hour into the proceedings. She should have left. She had gathered her maps and her instruments and her leather satchel full of hand-drawn measurements, and she was 3 steps from the door when she heard the attorney say something that stopped her cold. The claimant cannot produce a proper survey because no competent surveyor would certify land he clearly does not own. Olive had turned around. She had looked at Luke Hadley, this broad-shouldered man who sat alone in a room full of people who had conspired against him, and she had seen something in his face that she recognized with a bone-deep intimacy. It was the look of a man who had the truth on his side and no language to prove it, not because he lacked intelligence. She could see the intelligence in him. In the careful way his dark eyes moved from the forged deed to the commissioner and back again, calculating, measuring, held back by something she did not yet understand. She had set her satchel down on the table at the front of the room without being invited to do so. "I have something to say," she announced. Now those 3 commissioners stared at her. "Miss," Commissioner Greer said carefully, as though she were a horse he was not sure was broken, "this portion of the hearing is concluded. If you have business—" "I have survey data," Olive said. "That will prove that deed is fraudulent. And if this commission would like to render a lawful decision rather than an embarrassing one, you will give me 5 minutes." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She did not look back at Luke Hadley. She did not need to see his face to know what was on it. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck like sunlight through a window, and she had learned long ago that the moment you started worrying about whether someone was watching was the moment you started making mistakes. She opened her satchel and began to unroll the first of her survey maps. To understand how Olive Rourke came to be standing in that room, defending a man she had spoken maybe 30 words to in her entire life, you have to go back 6 weeks. Back to the morning she rode into the town of Haskell, Texas, with a mule named Ptolemy and a theodolite strapped to a wooden frame on his back, and the sun still low and red over the caprock like a promise the land was not yet sure it intended to keep. Haskell in October of 1882 was a town that had not quite decided what it wanted to be. The courthouse was new, the church was half finished, and the main street had 2 saloons for every dry goods store, which told you everything you needed to know about the priorities of the men who had built it. The cattle trade had come through hard 3 years running, and the railroads were pressing closer every season. And with the railroads came the land agents and the lawyers, and the particular kind of ambition that did not care what was already growing in a field before it arrived to plow it under. Olive had been hired by a widow named Mrs. Helena Carr to survey and legally document 80 acres that Mrs. Carr's late husband had purchased and fenced, but never formally registered with the territorial office. It was the sort of work Olive did a dozen times a year. Important, meticulous, and deeply unglamorous, which was exactly how she liked it. You could not argue with a good survey. You could not charm it or intimidate it or forge your way around it if the person holding the transit knew what they were doing. Numbers were honest. Measurements did not lie. She took a room at the only boarding house in Haskell, a 2-story structure run by a woman named Mrs. Penelope Driscoll, who had the eyes of someone who had seen everything twice and was no longer surprised by any of it. The boarding house was full of men, mostly drovers and a couple of drifters, and they looked at Olive with her surveying equipment the way men always looked at her. Some with curiosity, some with amusement. A few with the particular kind of resentment that comes from watching a woman occupy a space they believed was reserved for them by some unspoken covenant of the universe. She ignored all of it. She ate her supper, she studied her maps, and she went to bed early. She first saw Luke Hadley the following morning. He was at the livery stable when she arrived to settle Ptolemy in, and he was having an argument with a man Olive did not recognize. The stranger was well-dressed in the way that land agents and railroad men were well-dressed, which meant his boots cost more than a month's wages, and his eyes were doing the kind of busy calculation that had nothing to do with the conversation he was pretending to have. He was talking fast and smiling and holding out a folded document that Luke was not taking. Luke stood with his arms at his sides and his feet planted like he had grown there, and he was shaking his head. Not aggressively. Not with the hot anger of a man looking for a fight, just steadily, the way a mountain shakes its head, which is to say not at all because it simply does not move. "Mr. Hadley," the land agent was saying, "this is a fair price, more than fair. You would be doing yourself a genuine kindness." "No," Luke said, one word quiet as stone settling. The land agent's smile tightened at the corners. "I would encourage you to think carefully. The railroad survey puts the right-of-way directly through your north quarter section. The railroad survey is wrong," Luke said, still quiet, still utterly unmovable. "Well, now, that is a significant claim, and without your own documentation. I know where my land is," Luke said. "I have known it for 11 years. There was a finality in his voice that should have ended the conversation. The land agent heard it and ignored it, which told Olive that this was not a man who was interested in an honest negotiation. He kept talking, kept smiling, kept holding out the document, and Luke kept not taking it with the patient immovability of a man who had decided that this particular piece of ground was worth any cost. She did not speak to him that day. She had her own work to do, and a woman in her profession survived by maintaining a scrupulous neutrality in the disputes of others. She had learned that lesson painfully, 3 years back in the Panhandle, when she had made an offhand remark at a property line dispute and ended up with 2 competing ranchers both threatening to have her surveying license revoked. She had kept it barely, and the experience had taught her to observe first and involve herself only when the law and the data left her no choice. She spent the next 4 days on the Carr property, measuring and remeasuring with the careful thoroughness that was her professional signature. Mrs. Carr's 80 acres were exactly where Mrs. Carr said they were, properly bounded on 3 sides by natural markers, and on the 4th by a dry creek bed that showed clearly on the territorial maps she carried. It was good land, slightly elevated to the west, which would protect it from flash flooding, and the soil along the southern edge was a dark loam that made her fingers itch even though she was a surveyor and not a farmer. She saw Luke Hadley twice more during those 4 days. Once at the general store, where he was buying provisions with the spare efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he needed and had no patience for anything else. Once on the road north of town, riding a gray horse at an easy lope, heading toward the low hills where the light turned amber at midday, and the grass grew tall enough to brush the belly of a horse in the untouched sections. He did not look her way either time, and she told herself she had not particularly noticed him. On the fifth day, she was calibrating her transit on the eastern edge of the Carr property when she heard riders coming hard up the road from town. 3 men, moving fast, and behind them a fourth on the gray horse, who was moving just as fast, but somehow conveying a completely different quality of urgency. Where the 3 men ahead of him looked panicked, Luke Hadley looked furious. She stepped back from her instrument and watched as the riders passed. The 3 in front were the land agent she had seen at the livery, and 2 other men she did not know, and they had the look of people who had just finished doing something they had not quite expected to get away with. Luke reined the gray horse in at the crossroads and stood there watching them go, and Olive could see from 50 yards that his hands on the reins were the only controlled thing about him. Everything else in his posture was the contained fury of a man who has just been robbed of something and knows that chasing the robbers with his fists would only make the situation worse. She made a decision that surprised even herself. She walked across the scrub grass to the road. "Are you all right?" she called. He looked at her, looked away, looked back, as though he could not quite reconcile her presence with whatever was happening inside his own head. "You are the surveyor," he said. "Olive Rourke," she confirmed. "And you are Luke Hadley, who has apparently just been relieved of something you did not intend to give." He stared at her for a long moment. There was something careful in his expression, some weighing that she recognized as the product of a life spent being cautious with trust. "They took my survey stakes," he said finally. "All of them, every marker I had placed in the North Quarter section." "Why would they?" She stopped. She already knew why. No survey stakes meant no documented boundary lines. No documented boundary lines meant the only record of his land's extent was whatever the railroad surveyors chose to put on their maps. "How long have you had those stakes placed?" 3 weeks. Had a man come out from Abilene in September, cost me $60 I could barely spare. "Did you keep his written survey notes?" Something changed in his face, a kind of painful consideration. "I kept them," he said. "They are in my house, but I did not register them with the territorial office because the man said he would send the formal paperwork in 2 weeks, and 2 weeks came and went, and I wrote to him twice and got no answer." Olive had a very bad feeling that she recognized the shape of. What was this surveyor's name? Kellerman, Josiah Kellerman. She knew the name, not well but enough. Kellerman was a man who did periodic work for the railroad's land acquisition division. The kind of work that required a man to be willing to make what he saw conform to what he had been paid to see, rather than the other way around. She had heard his name mentioned in a conversation she was not supposed to overhear at a territorial land office in Lubbock, attached to an investigation that had subsequently gone nowhere because the people who would have needed to pursue it were the same people who had hired him. "Mr. Hadley," she said, "I think you need to hear something, and I need you to understand that I am telling you because the truth is the truth, not because I have any interest in your affairs beyond what fairness requires. The surveyor you hired, I have reason to believe he is not honest, and if the survey notes he gave you are the only documentation of your boundary lines, there is a real possibility that they do not accurately reflect your property." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she began to wonder if she had overstepped. Then he said, "How good are you, as a surveyor?" The question was direct, and without any of the hedging or condescension she was accustomed to from men asking about her professional capabilities. It surprised her. "I am the best surveyor in this territory," she said, matching his directness. "That is not pride. It is a professional assessment based on documented results." He nodded slowly, as though this was information he was filing away alongside everything else. "I cannot pay you until spring," he said. "The fall sale is done and the winter money is accounted for." "I am still working the Carr property for 3 more days," she said. "Your North Quarter section borders it on the west if I am understanding your land correctly." He nodded. Then I can survey it at the same time and you can pay me in the spring. But Mr. Hadley, she paused. If your property is as you say, and the railroad's claimed right-of-way runs through it incorrectly, this is going to go to a land hearing. You need to be prepared for that. I know, he said, and there it was again, that quality in him that she had first noticed at the livery, the quality of a man who would not move regardless of what the weather did. I was always going to fight it, I just did not know how. She went back to her transit. The next 3 days changed everything, though she did not know it yet. She surveyed the Carr property by day and Luke's North Quarter section by late afternoon and early evening, working in the long golden light that October throws generously across the Texas plains before it takes it all back in November. She used her own instruments, her own methods, and the very exact art she had spent years perfecting. Surveying in 1882 was not simple work even for a man. For a woman doing it alone, covering ground with a theodolite and a measuring chain and a field notebook, it required a physical endurance and a mathematical precision that had to coexist in the same body at the same time. You had to walk the lines repeatedly in different light conditions. You had to correct for magnetic declination and account for variations in the terrain. You had to triangulate off fixed points whose own positions had to be verified against established benchmarks, and you had to do all of this while carrying equipment and marking the earth and writing everything down in a field book that would eventually need to tell a complete, legally defensible story. Olive did it the way she did everything, thoroughly and without complaint, and with the particular focused pleasure of someone doing the exact work they were made for. Luke came out to watch on the second evening. He did not help, because he had enough sense to know that his helping would have been the opposite of useful, and he did not talk because he seemed to understand instinctively that her concentration required the kind of quiet that small talk destroys. He brought her coffee in a tin cup and set it on a fence post near her position without speaking and retreated to a respectful distance, and she drank it without looking up from her notebook and found that she was grateful without quite knowing how to express it. On the third evening, he sat on the fence at the edge of his north pasture and watched her work until the light failed, and when she was done putting her instruments away, he came over and asked if she would share his supper. She said yes. She wasn't sure why, except that the prospect of Mrs. Driscoll's boarding house and the noise of the other guests suddenly seemed less appealing than the quiet she had noticed settled around this man like a natural condition. His house was small and well-built, which told her about him, not elaborate but solid, the kind of structure put up by a person who intended to stay. There was a kitchen and a main room and what she presumed were 2 bedrooms, and everything in it was clean with the sparse cleanliness of a man who lived alone, but had not stopped caring about his surroundings. There were books, not many, maybe a dozen, but they were there on a shelf made from a single plank of good pine, and the spines were worn in the way that books are worn when they have been read repeatedly rather than just displayed. He made beans and cornbread with the simple competence of a man who cooked every meal for himself, and had long since stopped thinking of it as something worth remarking on. She sat at his table and they ate, and she found herself talking, which she rarely did with people she had only recently met. She told him about her work, not to impress him, but because it was the thing she understood best, and she had the sense that he was the kind of person who appreciated understanding over performance. She told him how she had learned the mathematics behind surveying from a retired Army engineer in Kansas City, who had been willing to teach her because her father had done a favor for him 20 years before. How she had practiced on every piece of land she could get permission to walk over for 2 years before she sat for the licensing examination. How she had worked for 3 years in the panhandle country doing work that established surveyors would not take because the pay was too low or the travel too hard, and how that work had taught her things about this particular land that she could not have learned any other way. He listened. He ate his beans and he listened to her with the quality of attention that she had only ever encountered in a handful of people in her life, which was the quality of someone who was genuinely interested in what you were saying rather than waiting for a gap in which to speak. "Why did you do it?" he asked when she paused. "Surveying. It could not have been easy." "Nothing worth doing is easy," she said. "And I was not willing to spend my life doing work that was easy." She watched him. "Why this land? You could have gone somewhere that was not going to fight back." He was quiet for a moment. "My father homesteaded east of here 12 years ago. He died before he got the deed finalized. This land," he stopped, "started again. This is different land, but I came here because I wanted to do what he did not get to finish. I wanted to put down something that would stay." Something in that answer reached across the table and touched a part of her that she did not usually allow to be touched during professional acquaintances. She picked up her coffee cup and held it with both hands and did not say anything, because some things did not require a response so much as they required a witness. She finished her survey the next morning. She sat for 3 hours at the table in her boarding house room, going over her field notes with the critical precision of someone who knows that her work is about to be challenged and must be without flaw. She checked her calculations 4 times. She replotted the angles twice. She compared her measurements to the original territorial survey of 1876, which she carried in a protective leather case, and she marked every discrepancy between her findings and the railroad's claimed right-of-way on a large clean sheet of drafting paper with a steady hand and meticulous labeling. The result was unambiguous. Luke Hadley's North Quarter section extended 340 yards further north and 215 yards further east than the railroad survey claimed. The claimed right-of-way, if drawn correctly, would not pass through his land at all. It would run along the territorial road on the north edge, which was exactly where the original 1876 survey had placed it. Someone had redrawn the lines. Someone had redrawn them deliberately and professionally, which meant Kellerman, or someone using Kellerman's certification to give a fraudulent survey an appearance of legitimacy. She went to Luke's ranch in the afternoon and showed him. She spread the drafting paper on his kitchen table and walked him through it point by point, and she watched his face as he understood what she was showing him. He was not a man whose expressions moved quickly. Things crossed his face slowly, the way weather moves across the plains, one condition displacing another gradually and with great deliberateness. She watched comprehension settle, and then something that might have been relief, and then a hard, focused anger that was completely without heat. The cold kind of anger that does not burn things up but simply refuses to go out. "This is solid?" he asked, not doubting her, verifying. "Completely," she said. "Would you testify to it at a land hearing?" She had already decided. "Yes," she said. "I will need to be formally retained. $1 technically to establish a professional relationship." He took a silver dollar from his vest pocket and set it on the map. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You keep cash in your vest pocket." Something happened to his face then that she had not seen before. The corner of his mouth shifted by approximately 3 degrees, which on a face as composed as his constituted an enormous change. "I had a feeling I might need it today," he said. She picked up the dollar and put it in her own pocket and tried very hard not to smile. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out, which gave the railroad's lawyers and their land agents 2 weeks to sharpen their arguments and sharpen their forgeries, which they used to great effect. 2 days before the hearing, Olive received an anonymous letter at the boarding house that suggested, in very careful legal language, that her surveying license was under review for procedural irregularities, and that testifying in a contested land hearing might complicate her professional standing considerably. She read it twice, folded it, and put it in her satchel next to her field notes, because it was evidence of a different kind of fraud and she intended to use it. She also received a visit from the railroad's primary attorney, a man named Edmund Waits, who arrived at the boarding house with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was perhaps 40, well-fed, with the kind of practiced charm that worked on people who had not spent their lives learning to read what was behind the surface of a smile. "Miss Rourke," he said, sitting across from her in the boarding house parlor. "I have no doubt that your survey work is technically excellent. I have reviewed your professional record. You are clearly very skilled." "Thank you," she said. "I am." He paused, recalibrating. He had expected the compliment to do more work. "The matter is simply that Mr. Hadley's claim, however sympathetic his circumstances, is not legally supportable. The railroad survey was conducted by a duly certified—" "By Josiah Kellerman," she said pleasantly. A brief stillness. "Yes, who is employed by the railroad's land acquisition division. He is an independent contractor who has done 17 surveys for the railroad in the past 3 years and has never once produced a result that was contrary to the railroad's interests. She had researched this the week before. That is either an extraordinary coincidence or a meaningful pattern, and I intend to make the distinction clear to the commission." Waite's charm thinned at the edges. "Miss Rourke, I understand that you have been retained by Mr. Hadley, but I want to be very direct with you. The railroad is prepared to offer Mr. Hadley a generous compensation for the right-of-way." "He does not want compensation," she said. "He wants his land, and I am going to help him keep it. Your license review was fraudulent, and I have the letter to prove it was sent, which will be considerably more embarrassing for the railroad than whatever trouble it was meant to cause me." She stood. "Mr. Waits, I have been doing this work for 6 years in this territory. I have had my license threatened before. I have had my surveys questioned, my measurements doubted, my competence challenged by men who were subsequently proven wrong about all 3. The one consistent thing in all of those situations is that the data always tells the truth, regardless of what anyone wishes it said. You are welcome to stay and have tea with Mrs. Driscoll, but I have work to do." She walked out of the parlor. She heard him leave 5 minutes later, and the fact that he left without another attempt told her more about what she had accomplished than anything else could have. That evening she went to Luke's ranch to prepare him for what the hearing would look like. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her notes spread between them, and she talked through the procedure, the order in which evidence would be presented, the questions the commissioners were likely to ask, the arguments Waits would make, and how she intended to counter them. She was direct and methodical, and she could see him listening with the same quality of attention he always gave her. That deep and genuine listening that she had stopped pretending was not one of the things she admired most about him. When she finished, she looked at him. "I need to ask you something," she said. He waited. "During the hearing, I need you to let me do the talking." Something crossed his face. "Not offense, something more complicated. You think I will say something wrong. I think you are the kind of man who says exactly what he means," she said carefully, "and Waits is the kind of attorney who is very good at taking what a man exactly means and making it sound like something else. He will try to provoke you. He will mischaracterize your statements. He will make you sound angry even when you are being perfectly calm." She paused. "The data is my territory. Let me defend it in my territory." A long silence. Outside, the wind was coming down from the north, the first real cold of the season pressing against the window glass. "You trust your own work that much?" he asked. "Completely," she said. He nodded. "Then I trust it too," he said. "I will not speak." She had not expected it to be that simple. She had prepared for an argument, for a negotiation, for the male pride that she usually encountered when she asked men to step aside and let her handle something. But he just looked at her with those dark eyes and gave her his trust with the same quiet finality he gave everything, and she found that she did not know quite what to do with that. She gathered her papers. She was at the door when he spoke. "Olive," she turned. It was the first time he had used her name. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him standing in his kitchen in the lamplight with the November wind at the window, and she felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. She turned away before he could see it on her face. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have a hearing to win." The morning of the hearing was cold and sharp, with a sky the color of blue slate and a wind that cut straight off the plains with nothing to slow it. Olive arrived at the Territorial Land Office in Amarillo, An hour before the proceedings began, and spent that hour alone in the anteroom going over her notes one final time, not because she needed to, but because the ritual of it settled her mind. Luke arrived 20 minutes before the start. He was wearing a dark coat she had not seen before, clean and well-fitted, and his boots were polished, and he had shaved with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that appearance carries its own argument. He sat down in the second row without saying anything to her, and she turned back to her notes. The commission convened. There were 3 commissioners. Commissioner Greer, the presiding officer, a gray-haired man with the careful neutrality of someone trying to appear neutral while being partisan. Commissioner Abbott, a younger man from the territorial governor's office who had the look of someone who understood that his career was being watched. And Commissioner Marsh, a former land agent himself, who Olive had noted with concern when the commission membership had been announced, and had spent a week thinking about how to handle. The railroad's case was presented first by Edmund Waits, with all the polished confidence of a man who had won 100 hearings just like this one. He presented the railroad survey, certified by Kellerman and duly notarized. He presented the original right-of-way authorization from the Territorial Railroad Commission, which predated Luke's land claim by 8 months, carefully worded to describe a corridor that on the railroad survey passed directly through the North Quarter section. He presented the offer of compensation that Luke had refused, framing it as evidence of the railroad's good faith. He was precise and organized and compelling, and Olive watched the commissioners' faces and saw that Greer and Marsh were receiving him well. Then he said the line that had stopped her from leaving. He said that Luke Hadley could not produce a proper survey because no competent surveyor would certify land he clearly did not own. And Olive had set her satchel on the table. Now she unrolled the first map. "Commissioners," she said, "my name is Olive Rourke. I hold license number 47 from the Texas Territorial Surveying Commission, issued after examination in Austin in 1879. I am also certified under the Federal General Land Office standards under the Homestead Act provisions. I have conducted more than 200 surveys in this territory in the past 6 years. I have been retained by Mr. Luke Hadley to conduct an independent survey of his claimed property, and I am here to testify to those findings." She spread the drafting paper flat on the table with 2 small weights she carried for exactly this purpose. "This is my survey of Mr. Hadley's North Quarter section, conducted using a Berger Transit theodolite and a 66-foot Gunter's chain, with corrections applied for the magnetic declination of this region, as established by the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in 1880. She pointed to the key in the corner of the map. These measurements were conducted over 3 days in mid-October and were cross-referenced against the original 1876 territorial survey conducted under General Land Office authority. She paused to let that sink in. The 1876 territorial survey was the gold standard for this region. Nobody disputed it. If she was cross-referencing against it, the commissioners understood. She was standing on the most solid legal and procedural ground available to her. "Mr. Waits has presented the railroad survey, certified by Josiah Kellerman," she continued. "I would ask Commissioner Greer to direct Mr. Waits to confirm the date on which Mr. Kellerman's survey was conducted." Waits straightened. "I don't see the relevance, the date, Mr. Waits." Greer looked at the railroad survey document. "The 14th of September," he said. "This year." "Thank you." Olive produced a second document from her satchel. "This is a certified copy of Mr. Kellerman's surveying work log, obtained from the Texas Territorial Surveying Commission under their public records provision. I made this request 3 weeks ago." She set it on the table. "On the 14th of September of this year, according to his own recorded work log, Mr. Kellerman was conducting a survey in Lubbock County, approximately 140 miles west of Mr. Hadley's property. He could not have been in both locations on the same day. The room, which had been quietly attentive, made a sound like a collective exhale. She did not stop. She did not look up to enjoy the reaction. She moved immediately to the next element because allowing the opposition time to recover was a mistake she never made. The survey bearing Mr. Kellerman's certification was therefore not conducted by Mr. Kellerman on the date it claims. She produced the letter she had received. 3 days before this hearing, I received this letter suggesting that my own professional license was under review, intended, I believe, to discourage my testimony. I am submitting it as evidence of the fraudulent efforts to suppress honest survey data in this matter. She looked at Commissioner Abbott, who was from the governor's office, who was watching with the alert attention of someone writing a report in their head as events unfolded. "Now," she said, and she turned to the large survey map, "let me show you where Mr. Hadley's land actually is." She walked them through it with the careful thoroughness that was her professional signature. She explained the triangulation method she had used, referencing the established benchmarks that any licensed surveyor or commissioner could verify independently. She showed the comparison between her measurements and the 1876 territorial baseline. She demonstrated precisely where the railroad's claimed right-of-way fell on the correct survey along the territorial road on the north edge of the property, exactly where it had always been. And she showed the 340-yard northward displacement and the 215-yard eastward displacement of the fraudulent survey, which had the effect of moving the right-of-way from public road to private land. She answered Commissioner Abbott's questions directly and in detail. She answered Commissioner Marsh's skeptical questions with data, not emotion, speaking numbers back at him with the calm assurance of someone who is not performing confidence but has the actual thing. When Waits objected to her methodology, she cited the specific federal surveying standards under which her methods were established and invited him to identify the particular section he found deficient. He did not identify one. She was aware of Luke behind her the entire time. She did not turn to look at him. She did not need to. She could feel the quality of his attention the same way she could feel it when she was working in his north pasture in the evening light, that concentrated and genuine engagement that felt different from being watched and more like being understood. It took 45 minutes from the moment she had set her satchel on the table. At the end of it, Commissioner Abbott turned to the other 2 commissioners and spoke quietly for less than 2 minutes. Then he turned back to the room. "The commission finds in favor of the claimant, Luke Hadley," he said. "The railroad's right-of-way survey is hereby invalidated on grounds of fraudulent certification. The claimant's North Quarter section is confirmed as his legal property under the provisions of his original homestead filing. The matter of Mr. Kellerman's certification fraud is referred to the Territorial Surveying Commission for investigation." He looked at Waits. "The commission also notes the evidence of attempted intimidation of a licensed professional witness and recommends that the Territorial Attorney General review the correspondence submitted by Miss Rourke." The room erupted. Olive rolled up her survey map with the calm efficiency of someone putting away tools after a job well done. She slid it back into its protective case. She gathered her other documents into her satchel and buckled it closed, and when she turned around, Luke Hadley was standing directly behind her. He was close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, which was not something she was accustomed to. She was tall for a woman, and she had not been required to look up at many people in her life. His face was doing the thing it did when something moved through it slowly. She watched the movement and could not quite name what it was because she had never seen his face look quite like this. "You knew all of it going in," he said. "Kellerman's work log, the letter, every part of it." "I had 3 weeks," she said. "A person can learn a great deal in 3 weeks if they know what questions to ask." "I have been trying to hold on to that land for 8 months," he said, "against lawyers and false surveys and men who had more money than me and more connections and more." He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "I could not do it, and you walked in there and did it in 45 minutes. "I had better tools," she said simply. "No," he said. "It was not the tools." She looked at him. "You kept your word," she said. "You did not speak. That was important. That took discipline. Not as much as you think, he said. When you were talking, I would not have interrupted you for anything in the world. The gallery was clearing around them, men filing out in the charged and restless way of people who have witnessed something they need to go and process elsewhere. Waits swept past them without looking at either of them, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Commissioner Abbott caught Olive's eye briefly and gave her a nod that carried genuine professional respect, and she returned it. Then the room was nearly empty, and it was just the two of them standing in the spilling afternoon light from the tall windows of the Territorial Land Office, and Olive discovered that she did not know what to do with her hands. She who was never uncertain about anything she was doing was uncertain about her hands. I owe you a great deal more than $1, Luke said. You owe me surveying fees, she said, to be discussed in spring as agreed. I would like to discuss them sooner, he said. Over supper tonight, not at the boarding house, he paused. At my ranch. She looked at him. I can cook more than beans, he offered. Something lit inside her that she could no longer pretend was not there. She had been not pretending for 2 weeks, which had exhausted her considerably. I have very high standards, she said. I know, he said, and there was that 3-degree shift at the corner of his mouth. I noticed. She agreed to supper. He cooked venison with dried apples and onions over the kitchen stove, and it was very good, and she ate it while he told her about his 11 years working toward the piece of land he had just, finally, legally secured. He had come to Texas at the age of 20 from Kansas, following the cattle trade north, working drives along the Kishom Trail for 3 years before he had saved enough to make a down payment on the land. He had built the house himself, plank by plank, the summer he turned 23. He had run cattle with modest success, and through droughts, and one very bad winter had held the operation together through work and stubbornness, and a refusal to take on debt he could not see his way to repaying. He was 31 now, and she was 26, and she thought about that only briefly before setting the thought aside as not relevant to anything. She told him about Kansas City, where she had grown up the youngest of 4 children in a family that had neither money nor the kind of social position that excused you from work. Her father had been a carpenter who read books and believed in the education of everyone regardless of sex, which was the gift that had made everything else possible. Her mother had been the practical force that kept the family housed and fed through 3 hard winters and a flood year. When the Army engineer had offered to teach Olive mathematics and surveying theory in exchange for her father's carpentry work on a renovation, she had taken every lesson with the hunger of someone who had always known that the world was much larger than the part of it available to her, and had been waiting for a way to access the rest. She had not married. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man who had initially supported her ambitions, and subsequently discovered that he only supported them in the abstract, and that the concrete reality of a woman who traveled alone and worked among men, and occasionally made more money than he did was something his self-conception could not accommodate. She had broken the engagement herself, which had been called scandalous by approximately everyone she knew, and the best professional decision she had ever made by every measure she could apply. She did not tell Luke all of this at once. It came out across the meal and the coffee after in the way that things come out when you are talking with someone whose attention makes you want to be honest. He listened to all of it with the same quality he brought to everything, and when she finished talking about the broken engagement, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, his loss, just that, his loss. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of something that is moving inevitably toward a place both people involved can see and neither yet acknowledges. She stayed in Haskell to complete the formal documentation of Luke's survey for the Territorial Office records, which was legitimate professional work that happened also to keep her in the vicinity of a man she was finding increasingly difficult to stop thinking about. She was honest with herself about this, even as she maintained the professional distance that her self-respect required. They had supper twice more at his ranch. He rode out to where she was working twice more, not speaking, bringing coffee or occasionally a meal wrapped in cloth that he set near her equipment with the same wordless consideration as before. She registered that nobody else in her life had ever understood instinctively what her working concentration required, and simply given it to her without being asked. In the third week, with the formal documentation nearly complete and no remaining professional reason to stay in Haskell, she rode out to his North Quarter section on a cold, clear morning to do a final verification check of her measurements, and he was there, not because he needed to be. Just standing at the fence line in the early light with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath making small clouds in the cold air, looking at the land she had helped him keep. She tied Ptolemy to a fence post and walked across the frost-hard ground to where he stood. "I am leaving in 2 days," she said. He looked at the horizon. "I know. I have work in New Mexico Territory next month, 3 surveys commissioned along the Pecos River. That is a long way." "It is," she agreed, a silence that was full of things neither of them had said. "Olive." He turned to look at her with those dark eyes that gave everything slowly. "I need to say something to you, and I am better at most things than I am at this, so I am going to say it directly and you can do with it what you think is right." She waited. "I have not felt about anyone the way I feel about you," he said. "I want to say that clearly before you leave, because I am not the kind of person who lets important things go unsaid and then spends the rest of his life wondering. You came here and you helped me keep something I would have lost without you, and that matters more than I have words for. But that is not why." He paused. "You are the most capable person I have ever met. I watch you work and I understand something that I do not think I have ever fully understood before, which is what it looks like when someone is doing exactly what they are meant to do. It is," he stopped. His jaw worked. "It is remarkable. You are remarkable. And I know you travel and you work and you have a full life that has nothing to do with this particular piece of ground, and I would not ask you to change any of that. But I wanted you to know before you left." She looked at him for a long time. The frost glittered between them on the dead winter grass. Behind them, Ptolemy made the small, resigned sound he always made when he was tied up and bored. The sun was coming up properly now, laying orange light flat across the plains, and she thought that she had surveyed a great deal of this territory and it had been beautiful in ways she valued deeply, but she had not often stood in it and felt that the beauty outside was answering something inside. "I travel 6 months of the year," she said. "I know. I will not give that up. I would not want you to." She looked at him. "You understand that I mean that completely. Not as something I say now and would reconsider later. I mean it as a permanent condition of who I am." "I know who you are," he said simply. "That is why I am standing here telling you this." She took one step toward him, and then another, and then she put her hand against his chest, over the dark wool of his coat, and felt him go very still the way a large and powerful thing goes still when it is being trusted, and she said, "I am not leaving in 2 days." Something cracked open in his face, not dramatically, just the slow opening of something that had been held very carefully for a very long time. He brought his hand up and covered hers, and they stood like that in the cold morning light on the land that was his because of her, and she felt more perfectly located than she had ever felt anywhere on a map. He kissed her. It was a careful kiss, the kind offered rather than taken, leaving her every choice, and she made her choice by stepping closer and kissing him back with the full conviction of a woman who, when she committed to something, committed completely. She stayed in Haskell for another 3 weeks. She wrote to her client in New Mexico and renegotiated the survey schedule to begin in January rather than December, which the client accepted after she explained that the delay was due to completion of additional work in Haskell, which was true in every way that mattered. She surveyed 2 more properties during those 3 weeks, because she was Olive Rourke and she did not stop working simply because she was falling in love. She also ate supper at Luke's ranch every other evening, and he came to sit at the boarding house parlor table and read on the evenings when she was working late, which Mrs. Driscoll observed with the quiet approval of a woman who had seen enough of the world to recognize two people making excellent sense. She rode to New Mexico in January as scheduled, and she carried the sharp specific ache of leaving in her chest for the first 100 miles, and then she set it aside and did her work with the thoroughness that was her gift, because love was not something that diminished her capacity for work, and she had always known it would not be. She wrote to Luke twice from Santa Fe, long letters by her standards, full of professional observations about the Pecos River terrain and also, gradually, other things. He wrote back. His letters were shorter and more careful with words, but they were precise in the way that everything about him was precise, and every sentence in them meant exactly what it said. She came back in March. He was waiting at the road's edge when she rode in, because she had written to tell him the day of her return, and he was the kind of man who, having been told a true thing, acted on it. He helped her unload Ptolemy without making a production of it, and she let him because her arms were tired, and she was not interested in performing independence at people she trusted. When the mule was settled and the equipment stored, he looked at her in the yellow March evening light and said, "I missed you." "I know," she said. "I missed you too." He made supper and they sat at his kitchen table, and she told him about the Pecos River surveys, and he told her about the winter's work, the cattle through the hard, cold months, a fence repair that had taken 2 days because the ground was frozen, the preliminary letter he had received from the Territorial Attorney General about the Kellerman investigation. Kellerman had, under questioning, implicated Waits and 2 railroad officials in the fraudulent survey scheme. The investigation was ongoing. Luke had been asked to provide a statement, which he had done, and Olive's own testimony from the hearing had been formally incorporated into the investigation record. "Commissioner Abbott sent me a letter," Luke said. "He said your survey documentation was the cleanest and most thorough he had seen submitted as hearing evidence in his 4 years on the commission." She absorbed this with the private satisfaction of someone who has been told that their work is exactly as good as they knew it to be. "I will write and thank him," she said. After supper, she sat in the chair by the kitchen window and watched the March sky go dark over his land, and she thought about what she wanted. Not in the half-formed way that had characterized her thinking about personal matters for most of her adult life, but clearly, with the same specificity she brought to a survey question. She wanted her work. She wanted the travel and the open country and the professional identity she had built. She also wanted this kitchen table and this quiet man and the particular quality of being known that she had not found anywhere else. She did not think these things were incompatible. She thought, in fact, that they were exactly compatible, in the way that 2 independent surveys can be reconciled against the same true baseline. "Luke," she said. He looked up from the book he had opened after supper, which was a habit she found she had strong feelings about. "Yes, I want to stay," she said. "Not stop working, stay. This as a home between the surveys, if that is," she paused, which she almost never did, "if that is something you want." He closed the book very quietly. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his version of a great deal of emotion that moved slowly and carefully and arrived as a kind of settled certainty. "It is what I want," he said. "It is what I have wanted since January." "You could have said so in January," she pointed out. "You had surveys to do," he said simply. "I was not going to complicate that." She looked at him. This man who had sat silent in a room full of people who were taking something from him and trusted her to speak when she said she would speak better. This man who had brought her coffee without words and let her work in his evening pasture and had said his loss about someone else's failure of perception and meant it without any shadow of condescension. This man who watched her work with genuine admiration and read books at his kitchen table and had built his house plank by plank at 23 because he intended to stay. "I will need a room," she said, "to work in, with good north light if possible. "There is a north-facing room," he said. "I have not been using it for anything. I will need a proper storage space for my equipment. I can build one in the barn. I will be away regularly, sometimes for months." "I know your work," he said. "I respect your work. You will come home when you come home." She rose from the chair. She crossed the kitchen to where he sat, and she put her hands on either side of his face, and the expression he turned up to her was so unguarded and so full of the careful, persistent love that had been building in him since October that it took her breath away. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he repeated, as though making sure he understood. "Yes," she said. To all of it. They married in May, in the half-finished church in Haskell, which had gained a roof during the winter and was perfectly suitable for a ceremony if you did not mind the smell of new lumber, which neither of them did. Mrs. Driscoll was there. Commissioner Abbott had sent a letter of congratulations that arrived 3 days after the ceremony, which Olive put in the correspondence box she kept on the shelf in her north-facing workroom. Mrs. Carr attended and wept happily and brought a cake that was arguably the finest accomplishment of the entire occasion. The ceremony was short and unelaborate because neither of them was interested in performance. The words they said to each other were the standard words, but Olive had added one element. She had written a brief addendum to the standard vows, which the minister looked at with mild alarm, and then accepted when she explained it was not controversial. She promised to respect his counsel. He promised to respect her work. They both understood that these promises were not additions to love but expressions of it. After the reception in Mrs. Driscoll's parlor, which involved a significant amount of the local population and a fiddle player whose enthusiasm exceeded his technical skill, they rode home through the May dusk on their separate horses, side by side, to the house that was now theirs. The north-facing room had been cleared, and Luke had built 3 shelves along the wall at a height he had measured carefully against where she stored her drafting paper when she laid it on the table, which was an example of the kind of attention he paid that still had the capacity to surprise her. She stood in the doorway of it and looked at the clean shelves in the early summer evening light and felt the rightness of it settle through her. She went to New Mexico in July for a 6-week survey commission along the Rio Grande. She wrote 3 times long letters. He wrote back in his careful, measured way, and one of his letters contained a sketch of the barn extension he had built for her equipment storage, drawn with surprising accuracy and labeled in his neat, spare handwriting, and she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and kept it there for the rest of the commission. She came home in late August to find the barn extension complete, and the north room fitted with a new drawing table he had made himself, angled correctly for drafting work, with a rail along the near edge to prevent papers from sliding. She stood at it and ran her hands along the smooth surface, and turned to find him watching her from the doorway with that slow expression. And she said, "I love you," in the direct, unadorned way she said everything. And he crossed the room and held her with the solid, encompassing gentleness of a man who understood the difference between holding on and holding close. In the spring of 1884, their son was born, a healthy 8-pound boy they named James Rourke Hadley, which Luke had suggested himself, noting that the Rourke name had earned its place in the history of this land and ought to be carried forward. It was the kind of thing, he said, that undid her, not the sweeping declarations but the quiet recognitions. James was born in the bedroom of the house Luke had built plank by plank, attended by a midwife from Abilene who Mrs. Driscoll had recommended, and he came into the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression of determined assessment, and both of his parents found this immediately unreasonable and wonderful. Olive took 3 months before returning to survey work, which was not a sacrifice because she did not experience it as one. She surveyed the near properties, staying close, and Luke managed the ranch with the competence he brought to everything, and learned to interpret James's various communications with the methodical patience he brought to every problem that mattered. Mrs. Driscoll came on Tuesdays and Thursdays to help, and by the time James was 6 months old had declared him the most agreeable baby she had encountered in 30 years of boarding house operation, which was a compliment she did not give lightly. The Kellerman investigation concluded in the winter of 1883. Kellerman received a 2-year sentence for survey fraud and had his license permanently revoked. Edmund Waits was disbarred and fined considerably more money than the railroad had paid him, which was a form of justice that satisfied Olive more than the legal penalties because it was proportional. 2 railroad officials were removed from their positions. The railroad, facing the exposure of a systematic pattern of land fraud, negotiated a settlement with 17 affected landowners, of which Luke was one, receiving formal legal confirmation of his property boundaries and a small financial settlement that he put toward improvements to the south pasture fence. By 1885, the house had a larger kitchen because Olive had stated flatly that the original one was inadequate for a household with a child and regular visitors, and Luke had immediately agreed and spent the early spring building the extension. She had helped with the framing, which she approached with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, and he had watched her measure and level with the same admiring attention she had first noticed at the Territorial Land Office, and she still felt a small, precise warmth under her sternum when he looked at her like that. She was commissioned in the fall of 1885 to conduct a survey of disputed land along the Red River, a substantial contract that required 2 months and brought her professional recognition at the federal level, as the General Land Office formally cited her work in a subsequent boundary arbitration between Texas and the Indian Territory. Commissioner Abbott, by then promoted to the Territorial Governor's Land Administration Office, wrote her a letter of commendation that she framed and hung in her workroom between her transit calibration charts and a map of the Pecos River she had made herself. James learned to walk in the spring of 1885, moving through the house with the particular determined wobble of a child who has decided that falling down is information rather than failure. Luke, who spent a remarkable amount of time sitting on the kitchen floor in order to be at James's level during these explorations, observed this with what Olive recognized as profound contentment. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen on a March afternoon and watched her husband and her son conducting a very serious investigation of the floorboards, and she thought about the word home, which she had spent most of her adult life understanding only partially, and felt that she now understood it completely. The fall of 1886 brought 2 significant things. The first was a drought that was hard on the cattle but not catastrophic, because Luke had made practical preparations across the summer based on the dry spring's warnings, which was characteristic of him. The second was that Olive realized she was pregnant again, which she had noticed with the calm precision of a woman who paid close attention to her own body, and told Luke on a September evening while they sat on the front steps watching the dry sunset. He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was the first thing he always asked and one of the reasons she loved him. "Very well," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat on the steps of the house he had built, while the sunset went from orange to deep red to the particular violet that preceded the first stars, and James, who was 2 and had recently become very interested in the concept of outside and was not yet reliably persuadable to come back in, sat in the dirt of the front yard cataloging pebbles with great seriousness. Their daughter was born in April of 1887. They named her Clara Jane Hadley, Jane for Olive's mother. Clara arrived with an expression of informed skepticism that made both her parents laugh in the delivery room in the way that exhausted, relieved people laugh, helplessly and at length, and the midwife who had been coming out from Abilene for 3 years now shook her head and said these were the most peculiar parents she had ever worked for, which Olive took as a compliment. By 1888, Luke's ranch had expanded modestly but solidly. He was not a man who pushed for growth beyond what he could manage well, which meant the operation was lean and healthy, and reliable through the price swings that ruined overextended operations. The Haskell area had grown considerably, and the half-finished church was now fully finished and had been joined by a school, a proper doctor's office, and a fourth business on the main street that was, for a change, not a saloon. Olive's reputation as a surveyor had grown to the point where she received commissions from 3 different territories and had more work than she could accept. She had made the considered decision in 1887 to take on a young assistant, a woman named Frances Boone from Fort Worth, who had the mathematical aptitude and the physical endurance the work required, and the particular kind of stubbornness that Olive recognized as professionally essential. Teaching Frances expanded her own understanding of her methods in the way that teaching always did, and Frances's quick practical intelligence was a professional satisfaction. James started school in Haskell in 1889. On his first day, Luke rode him to town on the gray horse, who had aged considerably but was still sound, and Olive watched them go from the front steps with Clara on her hip, and the feeling in her chest that was not quite pride and not quite joy, but was a complete and solid version of both. When Luke rode back alone an hour later, he came to where she stood and looked at her, and she could see that he too was feeling the weight of a small person going out into the world. "He will be fine," she said. "I know he will," he said. He looked at her. "He has your absolute certainty. He has your stubbornness," she countered. "They are the same quality from different angles." "Are they?" he said, and that small shift at the corner of his mouth was there, as reliable as a benchmark she had been measuring against for 7 years. That autumn Olive took a 3-week commission in the Texas Panhandle, the same high plains country where she had learned the hardest professional lessons of her early career, and she walked those red-brown distances again with her instruments and her field book and the comprehensive knowledge of 11 years, and she thought about who she had been the first time she had stood in this landscape and who she was now. Not different in any diminished way. More. Accumulated rather than replaced. The ambition was still there, the precision, the deep satisfaction of work done with complete integrity. And added to it now was the understanding of what it meant to be chosen by someone who had looked at her most essential self and found it not just acceptable but remarkable. She wrote him a long letter from a survey camp on the Canadian River, sitting in the light of a lantern with the wind off the high plains pressing at the canvas of the tent, and she told him this. She was not generally given to romantic sentiment in letters, but she told him this because it was true, and she had learned from him that important things ought to be said. His letter came back to Haskell 3 weeks after she did. He had written it the day he received hers. She could see from the date. It said, in his careful spare way, that he had known from the morning she walked across the frost-hard grass of his north pasture, with her satchel and her silver dollar, and her absolute certainty that this was not a woman he would spend the rest of his life adequately. He said that he had watched her stand in that land office and take apart a fraud and a conspiracy with nothing but honesty and expertise, and the particular quality she had that refused to be impressed by power, and he had understood something that he was still understanding every day. He said that he was grateful, specifically, that she had come to Haskell for the car property survey and chosen to stay. He said he loved her. Not in those words exactly, but in 4 sentences that meant exactly that and more, in the precise and considered way that he said everything. She read it 3 times at the kitchen table, and then folded it and put it with his other letters in the correspondence box in her workroom. Clara began talking in full sentences at 18 months, which the Haskell doctor called remarkable and Olive called predictable. By age 3, she was following her mother through the house, asking questions about the instruments on the shelves, with the intensity of someone who expected complete answers, and receiving them. James, at 7, had developed a comprehensive interest in cattle mathematics that Luke was quietly encouraging with the patient investment of a man who has already decided how he feels about this particular outcome. In the spring of 1890, Olive was contacted by the General Land Office in Washington with a formal inquiry about whether she would accept a 6-month contract to conduct surveys along the disputed Oklahoma land boundaries in preparation for the land run. It was the largest and most significant commission of her career, federal work of historical importance, and she sat with Luke at the kitchen table on a cold March evening and told him about it in full. He listened to the entire description without interruption. When she finished, he said, "Oklahoma Territory. Yes, 6 months, approximately. It could be longer." He considered this with the deliberateness he brought to important things. James was in the main room doing his arithmetic. Clara was asleep. Outside, the March wind was doing what the March wind always did on the Texas plains, pressing hard against everything and finding the gaps. "You should go," he said. "This is what your work has been building toward. Federal level, historical record." He looked at her. "This is important." "So is this," she said. She did not mean to sound defensive. It came out honest instead. "It is not a choice," he said. "It is both things. It is always both things. You go, you do the work, you come home. That is how we live." She looked at him across the table where they had eaten 1,000 suppers, where she had spread her survey maps and he had spread his ledger books, where James had learned to eat with a spoon and Clara had already attempted to climb twice. The lamp between them made the same warm circle it had always made. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "And you will be magnificent in Oklahoma Territory, and you will come home and tell me every detail of it, and we will be exactly as we are." She accepted the commission. The Oklahoma Land Run of 1889 had already occurred in April of that year, a landmark event in which thousands of settlers had raced to claim land that had been designated unassigned territory, and the legal chaos that followed was considerable. Parcels had been claimed imprecisely, boundaries overlapped, and the fraudulent claiming of already occupied land, known as Sooner claims, had created disputes requiring careful professional resolution. The survey work Olive was contracted to do was foundational, establishing precise legal baselines from which individual claim boundaries could be measured and verified. She went in May of 1890 with Francis Boone, her assistant, and 2 other surveyors from the General Land Office. It was the largest team she had ever led and the most demanding work she had done, requiring not just precision but diplomacy, as the settlers whose claims were being measured were universally anxious and frequently resistant to hearing that their boundaries were not where they believed them to be. She handled the diplomatic element with the same directness she brought to everything, which was occasionally jarring to people who expected female professionals to be softer in their delivery, but was ultimately more effective because she was always honest, and her honesty was always backed by impeccable data. She wrote to Luke every week. She received his letters every 2 weeks or so, delayed by the unreliable postal service in the territory. But when they came, they were substantive and thoughtful, and invariably contained some small specific detail that made the distance feel less absolute. A description of something James had done in school. A note about the south pasture drainage improvement he was working on. Once, a pressed wildflower that Clara had insisted be sent, which arrived slightly flattened but recognizably a bluebonnet. She was in Oklahoma Territory for 7 months. She came home in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, which was not a holiday she had celebrated with any particular ceremony before Luke, but which had become in the years of their marriage a quiet and specific pleasure. She rode the last 60 miles from the railhead at Abilene in one very long day, because she would not wait an additional night. He heard Ptolemy on the road, which was how he always knew she was close, because the mule had a distinctive gait that carried well in cold air. He was waiting at the gate when she came up the road in the December dark, and she dismounted before she was fully stopped, and he was there, and she held on with both arms for a long moment, and he held her back with the same completeness he always did. 7 months, she said, muffled against his shoulder. 70,000 acres surveyed, he said. His voice was quiet and warm and certain. According to your last letter, closer to 80,000. 80,000 acres, he said, and you are home. She lifted her face. He looked at her in the cold dark with the lamp from the house window making a distant warm square behind him, and she saw in his face the thing she had been seeing for 8 years. The settled and specific love of someone who has found the one person whose presence makes the world more accurately itself. I am home, she confirmed. James and Clara came tumbling out of the house in their nightclothes, because they had apparently been watching at the window for an hour, and the gate became briefly chaotic with a 7-year-old asking rapid questions about Oklahoma territory, and a 3-year-old who had decided that being carried was the appropriate response to this situation. Olive managed both while Luke took Ptolemy to the barn, which was a division of responsibilities that had settled into their life with the natural ease of something that fit. Later, with the children in bed and the house quiet, they sat in the kitchen with the good coffee that had been one of Luke's small domestic improvements over the years, a bag of decent coffee beans from San Antonio rather than the frontier standard, and she told him about the work. All of it. The legal disputes and the difficult settlers and the survey methods she had developed for the particular topography of the Oklahoma territory, and the satisfaction of knowing that the baseline she had established would serve as legal references for generations of boundary questions. He listened to everything with the attention that had always been one of the first things she had loved about him. When she was done talking, he said, "The General Land Office wrote to me." She looked at him. "To you. Commissioner in charge of the Oklahoma Survey Project. He wrote to ask whether you might be available for a subsequent commission in the spring, and he addressed the letter to your husband, which was a brief pause. An interesting choice on his part. What did you do with the letter?" "I wrote back," he said, "and told him that questions regarding your professional availability were best directed to you at your business address, which is the same as this one." He looked at her with that steady expression. "And I gave him your address." She stared at him. Then she laughed. It was not a common sound from her, real laughter, but it came up from somewhere genuine. "You wrote a letter to a federal commissioner telling him to contact me directly." "He should have done that from the start," Luke said simply. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand turned under hers and held the familiar specific warmth of it. "I will write to him," she said. "I assumed you would." Outside, the December wind pressed against the house. The lamp burned steady on the table between them. In the back rooms, their children slept. On the shelves of her workroom, her instruments were clean and ready, and on the walls of it her maps hung, documenting hundreds of miles of this country that she had measured and named and given legal form. And here at the kitchen table of a house built by hand on land that she had helped defend, in the warmth and the quiet of a life that was wholly and specifically hers, Rourke Hadley held her husband's hand and felt, with the complete and unambiguous certainty that was her oldest and most reliable instrument, that she was exactly where every line of her life had been accurately converging. She took the spring commission in Oklahoma territory. She came home in June. She went to New Mexico in the fall, and the following spring took a federal commission in Colorado territory, working along the Continental Divide in conditions that required everything she had. She came home from all of them, and each homecoming was its own precise and particular thing, and she did not take any of them for granted. James grew up with his mother's mathematical precision and his father's physical steadiness, and at 16, showed a strong inclination toward ranch management that pleased Luke enormously. Clara grew up asking questions about everything with an appetite that Olive recognized and nourished carefully, and at 14 was already working through the surveying mathematics that Olive had learned in Kansas City, which she did with a speed and facility that Olive noted with the private pride of a professional who recognizes a natural gift. In 1897, 15 years after the land hearing in Amarillo, the Haskell Quarterly published a brief article about the region's development history, and in it the incident was mentioned. A fraudulent railroad land survey had been exposed, it said, by a licensed female surveyor whose testimony before the Territorial Land Commission had been described by a commissioner as the most definitive and complete survey evidence he had encountered in his career. The claimant had kept his land. The surveyor had subsequently made her home there. Olive read the article at her kitchen table on a January morning with her coffee and handed it to Luke when she was done. He read it and set it down. "They did not get it entirely right," he said. "They rarely do," she agreed. "They said the claimant kept his land," he said. "That makes it sound like the land is the main thing that was kept." She looked at him. He was 55 years old now, and his hair had gone gray at the temples in the way that had always suited him, and he still had that quality of absolute stillness that had been the first thing she had noticed about him in the livery yard in Haskell 15 years ago. He looked at her the same way he had always looked at her, with the same attention, the same respect, the same specific and durable love. "What else was kept?" she asked, though she knew. "Everything," he said. And he held her gaze across the table where their children had grown up, and their plans had been laid, and their arguments had been resolved, and their joys had been celebrated, and their losses had been sat with. In the quiet and the lamplight and the long, ordinary, extraordinary days of a life built by two people who had found in each other not a limitation but an expansion, not a shelter but a companion for all the open country. "Everything," she agreed. The Texas plains in January were flat and cold and brown, and out the window of the kitchen, the north quarter section was winter-empty and still. It was the land she had measured first, the land she had proved, the land she had stood in with frost on the grass and her breath in clouds and her hand against the chest of a man who had given her his trust with the simplicity of someone who had already decided that she was worthy of it. She reached across the table. He took her hand. The coffee steamed. The house was quiet and solid and fully itself, and so were they.